From crushing devices to pointy objects and everything in between, the medieval era certainly had some terrible forms of punishment. These are just some of the worst ways women were punished for a wide range of crimes. First on our list are the beef tendon whips. Now this one is both equally nasty and painful. Some women who were caught committing crimes would be subjected to a terrible beating at the hands of many beef tendon whips. These were mainly used to punish any woman who was caught in the act of adultery. It was something that everybody wanted to avoid. A group of punishers would encircle the woman and hit her with the fleshy whips until they decided her punishment was complete. The meat was very thick and would actually hurt much worse than a traditional rope to ensure that this punishment was just as painful as it sounds. It would also take a long time for the wounds to heal, so this meant that the woman would be living in pain long after the whipping was complete. It also meant that they would have to look at their wounds and remember their crimes for a long time while being humiliated by their own punishment. On top of that, being smacked around with long pieces of meat just sounds like a truly disgusting time. Next on our list is the ducking stool. Now this might not look like a traditional torture device, but it was just as bad as the rest of them. The deadly ducking stool is basically just a chair that had been tied down to a plank of wood. It really doesn't sound too bad at all until you find out what it was used for. Any woman who had committed a very serious crime would be tied into this chair with no way of escaping. Once they were put into place, the ducking stool would be tossed into a large body of water, and the woman would be forced to struggle in her final moments. This meant that she would either drown or a wild animal would gobble her up before she sunk to the bottom. The ducking stool was clearly reserved for anyone who had committed a serious crime that demanded capital punishment. This is by far one of the worst ways to go, and proved that the authorities could use basic items to come up with some horrifying punishments. Up next is the Judas Cradle. Here's a device that is far less subtle and one of the last things any criminal would want to see. The Judas Cradle was essentially a large pyramid-shaped object that would rest on the ground while the criminal was suspended in the air above it. From there, a torturer would slowly lower the criminal down towards the cradle before it would eventually poke them in the backside. Now the torturer would continue to lower the criminal onto the tip of the pyramid for a truly terrifying experience. This device could actually be used as a form of capital punishment or a basic torture method. While it was easy enough for the authorities to end it all for the criminal, they would sometimes use it to get a criminal to confess to their crimes or provide them with important information. This was undoubtedly a brutal way for any criminal to face the consequences of their own actions. After that, we have tattooing. No, this was not the trendy art form that we know today. While some people were starting to experiment with traditional tattoos in the medieval ages, others were using it as a way to punish a certain group of criminals. This was yet another method that was used on women who had been caught in the act of adultery, and authorities had a clever and brutal way of punishing them for their infidelity. Now, first-time offenders would be forced into receiving a rather embarrassing tattoo that was usually placed on a very visible body part like their forehead. It would be a simple letter A to let everybody know exactly which crime the woman had committed. On top of the lifelong humiliation they would have to live with, the tattoo was also extremely painful. They did not have the advanced ink and needles we have today, so tattoos would usually be administered through other sharp objects like animal teeth. Next up, we have rat torture. It didn't always take a deadly device to inflict some serious pain on criminals. Authorities would sometimes turn to rats for a bit of assistance when it came to punishing some of their least favorite criminals. Rat torture was a pretty plain and simple method, but it was by far one of the worst things a person could experience. In this terrible form of punishment, a person would usually be held down on a flat surface while a rat was placed on their stomach. From there, a torturer would place a metal bucket over the rat so it could not escape. This would force the rodent to start digging into a person's chest. This is often used on criminals who were refusing to admit to their crimes, and the authorities decided that they would stop at nothing to get their confession. Now, if they confessed in time, they might be able to survive before the rat was able to dig too deep. Up next is the head crusher. This is a very self-explanatory name for a very terrible device. This was essentially a metal cap that would be strapped onto a person's head, while the torturer would grab onto a pair of large bolts on either side. The bolts are used to slowly tighten the vice on a person's head as the pain became even more excruciating the tighter it got. Now, much like the rat torture and other methods, this was often used as a vile interrogation method to get criminals to confess to their crimes. They could easily avoid any serious head damage if they admitted to their crimes right away, or else they could end up sustaining irreversible injuries. There was no way of escaping the deadly device, and it was by far one of the worst things to come out of the medieval era. Now we have the Stone of Shame. This one is more embarrassing than terrifying, but it's still one form of punishment that nobody wanted to endure. This was a large slab of stone that a person would be forced to drag behind them for a predetermined amount of time. This was obviously used on more petty crimes that did not call for any serious punishment, but it was still incredibly embarrassing and shameful. The Stone of Shame was mainly reserved for public intoxication and other small violations, and made sure that everyone was well aware of your bad decisions. The convicted criminal would have to drag the stone around town while the rest of the citizens were laughing in their face. Aside from the unbearable humiliation, the stone was also incredibly heavy. This would seriously wear a person down, but the ropes that were tied to them could also leave some nasty injuries. While some people only had to lug the stone around for a few hours, repeat offenders could have to hang onto it for weeks. Next on our list is the Brazen Bull. This isn't a live animal like the rats, but it might be the worst torture device of all time. Many classic writings have described this item as a true instrument of pain. The Brazen Bull was essentially essentially a large bronze casket that was designed in the shape of a bull. There's a small opening in the side of the statue that was barely big enough for a person, and this is where the criminal would enter for their terrible punishment. The door was bolted shut from the outside, and once that was complete, a torturer would use fire to heat up the bull from the bottom. There was absolutely no way for the criminal to escape this deadly device, so this basically meant you were being sentenced to capital punishment. The Brazen Bull didn't have a long run because it was so costly to make. It was certainly one of the worst forms of punishment the world has ever seen. After that, we have Impalement. This one was very simple and extremely painful. Once again, a person who was convicted of a serious crime was going to face another terrible punishment. Impaling someone was very quick and affordable for the authorities and very painful for the criminal. This one could actually be used as a form of capital punishment or a torture method, depending on what the authorities decided was the appropriate sentencing. If a person was sent to avoid capital punishment, they would usually be impaled on their arms or their legs just to ensure they would feel the consequences of their actions. This would usually result in life-altering injuries and amputation, so this method was usually reserved for the worst criminals in the land. If the authorities decided that capital punishment was the right call, then things would end pretty quickly for the criminal. This method was being used for thousands of years and stuck around right into the medieval era. And last but not least, we have the Thumbscrew. Here's another terrible torture device that looks just as painful as it sounds. This was a small device made from iron that had 2 slots for a person to insert their thumbs. It was a very tight fit with no way of wiggling out, and this allowed the torturer to inflict some serious damage. A large bolt was used to tighten the device and crush the person's thumbs until they had absolutely no use for them anymore. This device was basically the head crusher on a smaller scale, but the feeling must have been just as bad. Thieves who had been caught on multiple occasions would often be subjected to this terrible fate, as the authorities wanted to take away their ability to steal. You can only hope that the existence of this device might have stopped people from stealing in the first place. However, if they still wanted to take that risk, they might end up meeting this terrible form of punishment. Well, that wraps up our look at the terrifying punishments inflicted upon women in the medieval ages. We hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you all next time.